Hello, art historians. We're going to continue our study of the Renaissance. And by doing that, what we're going to do, sorry about that, is I'm going to just review those characteristics real quick. And I'm going to review them when I look at this. Remember that the idea in the Renaissance is that we show people and nature and not just religion, that we show a variety of actions and motion. And we work on making sure that that background has perspective and depth. When we talked about the Northern Renaissance, we talked about the introduction of oil. And we talked about the idea that in Northern Renaissance, a lot of this stuff is focused on religion, the religious aspects of what was going on. We talked about the Protestant Reformation and things like that. In Italy, we're really focused on humanism, the idea that man is valuable, that man is made in the perfection of God, and that things that man can create is important. As we saw in classical antiquity, the things that man created were beautiful. And so that's where we are now. And so I want to just make sure that before we continue on, we just remember some of the things that have to do with with the Renaissance. And we really are looking at that painting in oil and that humanism. And as opposed to in the North, where princes and kings were patron of the artists, in Italian Renaissance, the wealthy were the patrons of the artists. And so now we're going to move on to the Italian Renaissance. Okay. And this is going to be a lot of stuff that you might actually be familiar with, or you might actually know. These are some of the most famous Renaissance works. So the first thing we're going to start with is this little tiny building right here called the Pazzi Chapel. And the Pazzi Chapel is located at the Basilica di Santa Croce in Florence, Italy. It was designed by a really, really incredibly famous architect named Filippo Brunelleschi. And Brunelleschi is actually the guy that completes the dome at the main cathedral in Florence. And he's a really important guy. Now, what you're looking at is just a masonry building that is part of a larger cathedral basilica complex. It is not actually a chapel. It is one of those things that gets its name and then it's the wrong name, but then when we never change it. It is actually what's called a chapter house, which is a meeting space for monks. It was designed for monks to be able to go meet and sing and gather, but it is it's not necessarily a chapel. And it's absolutely stunning inside. And when I say the monks would gather to sing, the acoustics are built for singing. So while it was a gathering meeting space, it was also perfectly built for singing. And when you hear singing in there, it is the acoustics are perfect. When you look at it, you can see here's the door, and you see this really beautiful gray-green stone. And that gray-green stone is called Pietra Savena. And that is a particular kind of marble that Brunelleschi specifically chose for this Pazzi Chapel. And it's very much in contrast with sort of this brown stone and the yellow on the cathedral. And so it is meant to stand out. You are meant to notice the geometry. Much like the Pantheon, you're looking at the use of circles and squares, rectangles and ovals. And you see there that small dome at the top is very, very classical with your little tiny dome. That dome has an oculus, which has since been covered in glass, but it does have an oculus. And you see all these beautiful windows. And from here, it looks very small. You don't really get the concept of how large a space it is. It feels mostly square. It's a little bit more rectangular, but it feels mostly square. It is actually a bit wider than it is long. But let's go and look inside. So when you come inside and you look, oh, here's a beautiful picture of the dome. This is looking up through the dome, and there's that oculus there that's now covered with glass. And when you first come inside and you see this picture and you go, oh, well, what's the big deal about that? And then I like to point out that this is an 8-foot door. And so when I point out this 8-foot door, suddenly the dimensions matter. It's very difficult to see, but these are benches that are built into the wall. You sit here. These are chair height, and you sit on these benches, and you can sing, or you can sit, or you can gather. This would have been a place where they could have had a mass, but it wasn't specifically a chapel. And you really do see that beautiful geometry that Brunelleschi was looking for. We do have this dome sits like Hagia Sophia on pendentives. It is filled with squares and circles and arches and ovals. And it is also filled with the most amazing roundels. That's what they're called, Roundells, roundels, by a famous ceramicist named Luca della Robbia. And what do I mean by ceramicist? These are ceramic, these circles. They are not painted. They're painted, but they're painted ceramics that are there on the wall. They're beautiful. They are meant to, again, echo the circles that are present in the tops of the arches, and in the circles that are present in the windows, and the circles that are present in the oculus, and the circle that is present in the dome. Okay, so it is that return to the old, right? That's what the Renaissance is. It's a rebirth. And this is sort of almost like a reimagining of the Pantheon in a way to show the beauty of these new materials, in a way to highlight the concept of a classical construction, but with these new beautiful materials, a way to point out the wealth of the city of Florence at the time. Speaking of the wealth of the city of Florence, let's go forward. Oh, this is Brunelleschi's dome, by the way, the big dome that he built in Florence. This is the Santa Maria della Fiore, also referred to as just simply the Duomo. And it's beautiful, but Brunelleschi designed this as well. It's considered the greatest dome in existence. There you go. So speaking of the beauty and the power of Florence, let's look at this statue of David. So this is the statue of David by Donatello. And so when we're thinking about Donatello, we're thinking about him as one of our major Italian artists. Basically our Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Donatello, Raffaello, Leonardo, and Michelangelo. Like, those are our four. And so, and if you never made the connection that the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were all Italian artists, there you are. I have done that for you. So here is our statue of David by Donatello. And when we look at this statue of David, we are often caught off guard by what he looks like, and how small the statue is, and sort of the pose that he is in. I'm going to scroll forward very quickly. Actually, maybe I'll just come out of here. I'll go to this thing where I can see all of my slides, and I'm going to bring you to, oh, it's not on this one. Hold on, guys. I'm going to slide this down, and I'm going to open this up. And I thought that this was on my slideshow, but it's on the other one. When we think about the statue of David, we're used to seeing this, right? This is the statue of David we're used to. Like, he's giant. He's 17 feet tall. He's massive. Look at the height here that we see this person cleaning and polishing, and like that's what we're thinking about usually when we think about the statue of David. So what's the deal with this little guy? Well, the deal with this little guy is this is more like what the story of David in the Bible is. So you have to know the story of David to know what you're looking at. So this is David from the story of David and Goliath. And so in that story, in the story from the Bible of David and Goliath, what happens is the Israelites are being threatened by the Philistines. And they're the Philistines' major what is the word that I want? Their major fighter, their major, big scary guy is Goliath. And he comes into where they are and he basically is threatening to kill everybody, and nobody wants to fight Goliath because he's so big. He is like 8 or 10 feet tall. And everyone is afraid to fight him. And so because they're afraid to fight him, even the king is afraid to kill him. To fight him. And so what happens is we have little teeny tiny David who, finds out that even the king, who was Saul at the time, Saul is afraid to come out and fight Goliath. And so David comes rolling up and is like, well, if none of you will fight him, I will fight him. And it's because they're hanging out in this like this plain, like kind of like the desert, for 40 days at like this standoff. And like, what are we going to do? Who's going to do this? Who's going to fight? What's going to happen? And so King Saul and the Israelites, they don't know what to do. And so finally David's like, well, this is just ridiculous. And David says, and he's a little kid. None of his brothers will fight Goliath. No one will come out. And so David says, fine, I'll do it. And people are like, you're going to die. And David's like, well, I'm going to go. And they give him a sword, and the sword is too big, and they try to give him some other stuff and some stuff to protect him, and nothing fits. And so finally he says, well, I'm just going to do this my own way. And he is good with slingshot and rocks. So he goes out and he fights David, this giant. He hits him in the head with the rock from his slingshot. He defeats him. The Israelites are saved from the Philistines, and David eventually becomes king of the Israelites. So what does this have to do with this statue? And what does this have to do with the power of Florence? So this statue was actually, I just came up with the word sponsor, but that's the wrong word. Commissioned. Sorry, guys. It was commissioned by Lorenzo de' Medici. Okay, so like of the de' Medici family. And so Lorenzo has Donatello craft this statue of a very young David. That's why it's only 5'2", with the rock in his hand. That's what you see right here is David with the rock in his hand. And you see David, little tiny David, with his foot on the decapitated head of Goliath. Okay, standing on Goliath's head. And in his hand, he has Goliath's sword, right? Because he couldn't pick that sword up and use it. It's too big, right? So what does this have to do with anything? Well, at the time, Lorenzo Medici had just sort of made Florence really important. And prior to Lorenzo Medici trying to increase the importance of Florence, Milan had been considered the most important city in Italy. And Lorenzo Medici does a whole bunch of stuff to make Florence important. And Florence had been a much smaller and less well-known city. That what we frequently refer to in sports nowadays as the underdog. Florence was the underdog. And Florence comes out of nowhere, comes for Milan, and destroys basically Milan's hold on trade and shipping and all of that stuff. And Florence becomes the most important city in Italy. And so Lorenzo de' Medici had this created as a way to personify the battle between Milan and Florence. And so in this personification of the battle between Milan and Florence, Goliath is clearly Milan, the much bigger city. Florence is clearly David, the much smaller, upstart. And in that, we have the sort of the personification of the success of Florence. Now, we have that with then a lot of really cool Renaissance-y stuff that goes with it. Okay, so on Goliath's head, we have these ancient chariots. And remember, this is the Renaissance, the rebirth of the classical ancient arts. Okay, this Renaissance is a return to the study of Greek and Roman sculptures, Greek and Roman imagery, Greek and Roman myths, and so you see that sculpted onto the top of Goliath's helmet. But when you look at what you see here, what you're looking at is David, who has a very, very young face, because remember, he's just a very young boy. He doesn't, when you look at his face, he doesn't have a beard because he is so young. There's Goliath's all shaggy beard. And when you look at David, you see that he's very young. Mrs. Horman, why is he nude? Well, because he could be. This is a return to our ancient Greek idea of classical nudes, of looking at the human body as something that was created by God and that is beautiful. And people were okay at this point with there being nudes as long as they were ancient Greek Roman stories or figures from the Bible. They were okay with that. And so what you see here is you see the figure of David in his Renaissance shoes and his Renaissance hat, but otherwise he's nude. Okay, and this is a return to classical construction. This is done in lost wax bronze, the same way that the ancients did the seated boxer. So we return to the ancient ways of making art. And this is considered one of the most important, if not the most important, early Renaissance sculpture. It is, in fact, the first freestanding nude since antiquity. Donatello was the first one to say, you know what, it's going to be okay if we do nudes again. And this is the first nude sculpture since ancient Rome. And so we see the return to contrapposto standing. Okay, this definitely feels human. Okay, he looks alive. He looks real. Think about the Roque and Pietà. She doesn't look human. We see her face, but she looks almost like a caricature, like a cartoon. David looks real. David looks human. And remember that humanism is that idea where we can have things that show the ability of man to create, because God made us and God made us so that we could create these things. So it is okay for artists to sculpt nude figures because God made us look this way and God made us able to sculpt them. And that is what humanism teaches. Here we also see David he's so young. And it is that idea that David later goes on to be the king of Israel. Like the Star of David, that's this David. And so we see that he's very young. This hints at the long life ahead of him. This looks at the long reign that he will have. But also remember, this is sort of hinting at being sort of like Florence. So it's hinting at or hoping for a long, powerful reign for the city of Florence. When you look at his head and his face, you see that his he has his head lowered. That is meant to show humility. You see that in his hand he holds a rock that shows that he had more rocks to use to kill Goliath if he needed to. We see that sword that is Goliath's sword, that's almost as big as he is, that shows us that he could not have fought Goliath with a sword. He just was unprepared for that. So he had to do his own thing. And so, but you will also see that there is, it's sensual, not sexual, it's sensual. Okay. It appeals to your sense of vision. It does appeal to your sense of touch. You can almost imagine what it would feel like to touch that, like, beard there and those leaves at the bottom. It's a very sensual piece. Okay. It appeals to your sense of touch. And so, it's just a beautiful, beautiful sculpture. Okay. Since we're talking about Florence, and we're going to talk about Florence a lot during the Italian Renaissance, because Florence was like the most important city in Italy at the time, we're going to talk about this building. I don't say this very often, but this is one of the times where I'm going to say I really am not a fan of the College Board having chosen this one. I wish that they had chosen the Palazzo Medici, the Medici home in Florence, but they didn't. They chose, this is called Palazzo Rucellai. Rucellai, that's how you would say that. This is in Florence. This is by the architect Leon Battista Alberti, who is considered at the time in Renaissance to be only the second most important architect of all time, behind Vitruvius, who is our architect from ancient Rome. Now, that's at this time. We end up with some more buildings after this that then, kick Alberti out of his role as most important architect. But at the time of the construction of this, Alberti was a really big deal, which is why the Rucellai family chose him to create their family home. So let's talk about this. These are the Rucellai. The Rucellai were business partners with the Medici. And because they are business partners with the Medici, when they were doing very well, they wanted to have a beautiful palazzo or palace built for them. And so, of course, they have to have only the best. So they get Alberti to design theirs. And when they get Alberti to design theirs, they do want him to pull in some things that are similar to the Medici palace. And so Alberti copies some of the things from the Medici palace. And what we're basically looking at is a modern day, for them, modern day palazzo that is meant to feel old. So all three of the floors are the same height, but they don't look it because of the way Alberti built them to look like you had a very tall main story and then a slightly smaller second story and then an even smaller third story to give the idea that the building is much taller than it actually is. It helps to emphasize height. It helps to give it a stronger presence. Alberti studied ancient Roman architecture. He studied ancient Roman arches. He studied the book of architecture by Vitruvius, and he wrote his own called On Architecture, which is an important book that architecture students read to this day. My nephew read it in his school. So it does look a little bit like the Medici Palace with some very with some differences, enough to make it so it looks like, here's that word that hopefully you know, and otherwise I'm going to teach it to you, is homage, Homage, homage. An homage to something is you sort of hint at it, but it's not exactly the same, and you do that because you want to show respect to it. And so the Rucellai had their palazzo built to look like the Medici palazzo so that they could say, we are paying tribute to you, Lorenzo de' Medici, to your family, and we are showing our loyalty to your family. And so it's a really cool building. The bottom floor, these pilasters, it's not a column. Because it's flat, it's a pilaster. And these pilasters are in, each level is a different form. So the bottom one is your Doric. The second one is Alberti's version of an Ionic. And the third one is Corinthians. We have these really cool, beautiful pilasters that are flat columns. This line that runs here between each level is called a string course. And that string course is on there so that it defines for you where the levels of the building are, but because of the distance between the top of the arch and the top of the next string course, it just makes each floor look a little bit smaller to focus on the height, to make it look taller. When we go to the next page, what you're going to see is there's beautiful decorations at the tops of each of the columns in this stuff that's called dentil molding, like actually DENTIL. It's like, but it is pronounced dental, like your teeth, because that's what they look like. They look like teeth. And there's lots of really beautiful carvings of ships and things like that to focus on their role in trade. When we're talking about city spaces, when you look here, you can see the bench. The benches there at the bottom ground floor are there because Albertis were tradesmen. They traded. They went out and they got things from one place and brought them back to that place and traded them for. They were merchants, and so actually they would have lived on the upper floors, and that bottom floor would have been where their sales stuff was, and so they could have had customers here on these benches, and that's what those benches are for. And so it's just really, it's again, that idea of Renaissance return to the classical. Here's your column, here's your tympanum, here's your arches here. It's called here's your keystone. These are all ancient designs. And so we're going to stop there today. This is Italian Renaissance 1. I'm going to do a few videos of Italian Renaissance just so that we know that we have, we can spread them out a little bit. But what we're looking at is, so what we looked at today was Palazzo Rucellai, David, and the Pazzi Chapel. I will see you next time for our next section of Italian Renaissance. Have a good one and see you later.